Welcome everyone to the 2020 TTED Visual Presentation Online Edition. Today I'm going to be showing you guys how to make lemon loaf, and I'm joined by my lovely cameraman, my cousin Tyler. And I'm just going to jump right in and we're going to go over the utensils that we're going to need, followed by the ingredients. So I have a medium mixing bowl to cover the dry ingredients and mix everything together in the end. A smaller mixing bowl for the wet ingredients, measuring spoons, rubber spatula for the mixing, measuring cups, whisking for mixing the wet ingredients, a small knife, which we'll need near the end for the lemon, a grater, using the small side to grate the lemon rind, and a plate to catch to the bottom of the lemon rind, and a loaf tin. This is an 8x4. It's called the small kind. You can use a larger one. That'll just affect the bake time when you put it in the oven, and we can go over that later. Okay, so that's all the utensils that you need. So the ingredients that you'll use is flour. As long as it's wheat flour, it's fine. You can use unbleached or whole wheat. It'll just change the color of what it is and maybe a bit of the flavor if it's whole wheat. Granulated sugar. We don't use any finer than this, or we don't use brown sugar because it'll mess with the texture of the food. Baking powder. Any name brand is fine. I recommend getting as cheap as possible because there really isn't any difference in the baking powders that you use. Table salt. If you only have the shaker, that's totally fine. So that's the dry ingredients. These are the wet ingredients. We have milk. It can be 1, 2, or 3% as long as it's just milk from cows. It can be lactose free as well. 2 large eggs. Now they have to be large because otherwise it'll mess with the texture of the lemon loaf and how the reaction takes place. You might have a lemon loaf that isn't as fully cooked or isn't as well blended if it were a medium or an extra large egg. Oil. I recommend soybean, canola, or vegetable because those are the 3 that are as flavorless as you can get. If you use something like peanut oil, then you would have a lemon loaf which has like a peanutty aftertaste. So I don't recommend that. 1 whole lemon and some lemon juice just to spare, because when making the glaze, it might be a bit granular if your lemon isn't big enough. So that's just as a safety measure. So the reason why I chose lemon loaf is because when people go into baking, they start out with cookies, and I'm running the assumption that you or my students in the future, if I teach home ec, that they have already done cookies before, they know the show, they know how to, lay blobs onto the pan and bake it in the oven and get cookies. This is a step up. It can get them into baking cakes. It can show them the importance of precision and the ingredients that you add. And it's just something unique for a change. And it's very easy to get into. It's not, you don't have to get any extra ingredients or any expensive things like cream cheese. All you need to do is grab a lemon and maybe lemon juice to be safe, just to add that on top of what you already have in your pantry. Okay, so the first things that we want to do when we bake is we want to wash our hands and we want to tie our hair back if our hair is longer, if it can get into the food. I already washed my hands and my hair is, I'm due for a haircut, but we're good on that end. So now we gotta look at the recipe and we gotta go, what temperature does this have to be baked at? So on the recipe, it has to be 350 Fahrenheit. So we'll just preheat the oven and we'll get that started. So now we're gonna add the dry ingredients first. No particular reason, just cause. One thing to note though, is that we level off our ingredients with anything flat. I just use a butter knife. More advanced people use metal spatulas. But that's just not something that can be bothered with buying. Okay, so on the recipe we have 1.5 cups of flour. So I'm gonna measure that. And then I level it off have it flush with the top. Just swipe it off like that. So that's 1 cup. And a 1/2 cup. Okay, so now we need 1 cup of sugar. We might not be able to fit the 1 cup into here, but we'll have to see. No, we'll just pour it out. Needs a little bit more. Pour a cup over the sugar, level it off. And remember, we level it off just to make sure that we're adding exactly what the recipe intends, and that is 1 cup sugar. Okay, so now we do 2 teaspoons of baking powder. Now for leveling this off, I went ahead and took half of the safety seal and just ripped it off like that. So now you can just take your baking powder, pull it up, press it against the top, and you have a level teaspoon. Now this needs 2 teaspoons of baking powder, so I'll do it again, and we're done. So next up, we're gonna need a 1/2 teaspoon of salt. And remember, you can just get this out of your shaker. As long as it's salt, you're good. Kosher. I think even sea salt would be fine if you broke it up a little bit finer. Okay, so it's a little bit over the top, so I'm just gonna level it off a bit. Just over the sink. And we're good there. Okay, so that's the dry ingredients. You can just take your rubber spatula, give it a light mix. Make sure that the baking powder is all evenly distributed, just to make sure that it mixes evenly when you add the wet and it bakes evenly. Okay, so now on to the wet ingredients. We're gonna need, I should also mention that if you have wet measuring glasses, like they're in the shape of pitchers and they have all the demarcations on them, you can use that as well. I don't have them, so I just use these measuring cups. In baking and cooking, they're also called dry measuring utensils, but doesn't matter to me. It all turns out the same anyways. Okay, so this calls for half a cup of oil. And 1/2 cup of milk. And 2 large eggs. Now I'm not gonna crack them directly into the bowl just to be safe. I don't want any eggshells to come into the mix. Come here a little bit closer. I just crack it in like so. Can add that in. Oh, a little messy, but no shells, so we're good. We add that in there. So now I'm just gonna lightly whisk it. Like with the dry ingredients, I wanna make sure that when I mix the 2 together, it's gonna be evenly distributed, it's gonna bake evenly, and it's gonna taste great. I'm just gonna whisk it until it looks emulsified, which means that the oil is blended enough with the milk so it doesn't look like it's pooling on top. so it will look creamy, so to speak. Okay, that looks good enough by my standards. And now to add to our wet ingredients, we're gonna add our lemon rind. Now, when grating the lemon, I'm gonna use the fine end of the grater, and I'm gonna take it down to the pulp, and you're gonna know that it's down to the pulp when you see white. Well, it's not grating that well. It might just be that this lemon is a little bit old. Yeah. So right here, when it gets down to this bright white part, that's when you know that you grated enough of it, and you move on to the next part of the lemon. Now, the recipe calls for the rind of a whole lemon, so you're gonna grate all of the rind off until it's all down to the pulp. And I think we might be here for a while. Ideally, you want to get a fresh and firm lemon so it comes off easier. Oh dear. Okay, now it's going. That's the oven just telling us that it's ready to go. Okay, now ideally you want to go again until it gets down to this white pulp, but I'm having so much trouble with getting anything out of this lemon because of how old it is, so we're just going to move on. Now, this is a little bit on the light side for the amount of rind you should be getting, but as long as you do the rind of a whole lemon, if you try this at home, turn out a lot better. So that's in there. We'll just give it a mix once it's in there. Threw my whisk out. Wasn't my smartest idea, but now we're gonna add the dry into the wet. I'm just taking my rubber spatula, wiping out the inside to make sure that I get every last drop. And we're good. Now, loaf batter doesn't have to be mixed a whole lot. If you were making something like banana bread, if you mixed it until the clumps just started to settle, then it would be completely normal. Because at the end of the day, loaves don't need that super fine texture. Like, you're not making a cake or anything, it's just, well, flavored bread, so to speak. So I'm just looking to mix it until all the dry parts are into the batter. Make sure I get all the stuff around the bottom. And I'm done. Now, the reason why you don't want to over mix it is because it'll make it more dense and it won't rise as well. You won't get a fluffy loaf, so to speak. It'll be more like a pound cake, just really dense and just almost too hard to bite through when you eat it. So this is gonna go into our loaf tin, but before we do that, we have to grease and flour it. The reason why we're greasing and flouring it is because we want the loaf to come out of the tin. Now for cookies, you might recall that you only need to grease it. And that's because in cookies, it's not meeting the sides of the baking surface, and it has a lot more fat content in it. So just by baking in the oven, it'll create a surface that just essentially falls off if it's greased. So I just have my hand in a bag here so I can grease the tin without getting too dirty, so I can just carry on with what I'm doing. You can grease it without a bag, no problem. You can even use PAM, like non-stick cooking spray. As long as you get a flour coating in on the surface, you're fine. So set that aside. So now comes the flour. You only need a couple tablespoons. Like I'm only using yay much. And I'm just gonna get it in there. I'm gonna shake it around. And now to get it along the sides, I'm gonna tap it. I'm gonna shake it back and forth until it runs up the sides. You might want to do this over a garbage can, but you guys gotta see what I'm doing here, so. Okay. So now that that's all done, it's all floured. You just gotta take it over to the garbage can or sink, flip it upside down and give it a couple taps, which I'm gonna do right now. It looks just like that. Now we're ready to add the batter. So, just gonna take my rubber spatula, work it to one side of the bowl so the pour out is easier. Just gonna spoon it in like so. If you really want, you can take a spoon and you can just run it along the side of the spatula and the bowl to get every last bit out. I figure I'll do it because why not? You guys might as well want to see this. So I'm just getting every last bit off of the spatula. Clean, no muss, no fuss. That can go in the dishwasher. And we have our loaf batter in the tin. This goes in the oven on the middle rack, and it has to be the middle rack because if it's too low to the ground, then the bottoms and sides will turn out almost burnt. And it's not too close to the top, otherwise it'll take too long to bake. And you might even have it where the bottoms and sides are raw and sticking to the side. So we have it in the middle. That's all good to go. Now for a tin this size, I'm gonna bake it for 50 minutes to 1 hour. So I set my timer to the underside, just so we don't overdo it. Now just one final note, if you are using a larger loaf tin, which is a 9x5, you might see results at baking it at 325 Fahrenheit for 35 to 40 minutes. The lower temperature being the reason for the heat doesn't have to penetrate through the thickness, like as much thickness as this. Since the batter is in a smaller tin, it is taller in nature, so it needs a higher temperature for a longer time, but if it's distributed in a larger tin, it's a lower temperature for a lower time. So that's it for this portion. Following this, we'll be doing the glaze and how to tell when the loaf is ready. So I'll see you in the next part.